So I'm excited to be here with you today. Before I begin, though, I do have a demo planned, so you know how well that's going to go. But if you want to participate in this, I would suggest that you take a picture of this slide so I can move on. And what you're going to do is you're going to take a domain name of yours and point it at this IP address. And if you're using Cloudflare or something fancy, don't orange cloud it, just do a simple DNS record. So create an A-type record with this IP, and then just wait for my queue. But yeah, we'll come back to this later. So does everyone have a picture of this slide who would like a picture? Okay, I'm going to move on then. Okay, so real quick about me. I have to confess, I'm not actually a PHP developer. Thank you for having me anyway. But I used to be, actually. I started with PHP in 2003, back with PHP 4, when using SQL queries was still precarious and dangerous with SQL injection. And I remember, anyway, I remember a lot of the old school PHP ways. But that led me to get a job where I learned Go, and I've been doing that ever since. And that's where I wrote, well, not at my job, it was at university. I wrote the Caddy web server because I needed a web server. And my specialty ended up becoming automating certificates, TLS certificates, especially at scale. And I talked about this actually at API Platform, the very first conference 3 years ago. So you might remember, if you saw that talk, a diagram that looked kind of like this, where this is the architecture of a traditional PHP site. On the right, you've got your PHP files and the PHP interpreter running your scripts. And on the left, you've got the web clients, so your API clients, web browsers, mobile apps, that kind of thing. And in the middle, you've got the web server. That's kind of the glue here. The web server's job is to terminate all of the web protocols, so HTTP, TLS, WebSockets, etc. And it's supposed to load and serve all your static resources like your HTML, CSS, JavaScript, images. It has to know about your PHP files so that it can know when to serve PHP. And to do that, it has to decode the HTTP request, re-encode it as fast CGI, send it off to PHP FPM, which then has to run your PHP script and return the output to the web server, which has to send it to the client. There is a lot of latency in all these moving parts. It's very complicated, honestly. And this has been kind of a tough point for PHP for quite a few decades. This has been a bit of a rough spot. It would be so nice, wouldn't it, if we could just delete it and get rid of all those latency. Well, we can't delete the internet connection, but we can optimize that. Now, this is much better, except that now we have no way to run your PHP scripts. No way for the web server to get the output and communicate with a PHP interpreter. So what if we just move everything into the web server, kind of like this? Well, this is basically an application server. This is actually a special one, though, because Caddy is the web server. And I'll show you why that's significant. But also, you notice that we put in here your page resources, like your HTML and your JavaScript and your CSS. And this is now all self-contained within your web server binary. And this is much better. And it turns out this is exactly what Kevin and the API Platform team have created, is this monster, this wonderful monster called FrankenPHP, that uses Caddy as the web server, this Go program, and they've embedded the PHP runtime and interpreters into this Go program. And so now your website is completely self-contained. And in the process, they've optimized the network connection by supporting HTTP 3 out of the box, and 103 early hints, which that's not a HTTP version. It's more of a feature of HTTP. I'll talk about it. But now every part of that old architecture has been deleted and optimized, and API platform, your sites are benefiting from this. So how about a big round of applause for Kevin and the API platform team? This is seriously amazing engineering. This is what I wanted 20 years ago when I was writing PHP, but the technology didn't exist. So when Kevin hopped into our issues and eventually into our developer Slack and started working on it, I was thrilled. I was thrilled. So thank you again for that and for having me here to be able to talk about this, fulfilling kind of a nerd dream of mine. And it turns out this architecture actually solves a lot of problems that have gone with the territory. Caddy automates TLS certificates. So your sites serve over HTTPS automatically. You get memory safety because Caddy is a Go program. And that means that bugs like Heartbleed, if you remember that from 2014, are impossible. We've sped up your site by eliminating latency. Your deployments are so much easier with a static binary, and there's fewer moving parts. You get the idea. But all of this comes for free with API Platform. It's out of the box because of API Platform's stack, which I think is really cool. And some people are starting to discover this. A few weeks ago, Jacob told me on Twitter that their sites are loading in under 30 milliseconds, which is 5 times faster than they were with PHP FPM, and twice as fast as they were with Nginx unit. Another developer, Martin, says that they cut their load times in half just by switching to FrankenPHP. When I talk about FrankenPHP and Caddy in this talk, I'm using them interchangeably. But anyway, this is very impressive with no code changes. But there's actually more that you can get from this that you may not know about. So that's what I want to talk about today, is that API Platform has this kind of hidden potential underneath the hood. And so we're going to peer under the hood at the engine that runs API Platform, so to speak, and give you some ideas. Now, not all of these will be relevant to all of you, but I hope that they give you some ideas, and some of you may like this and may want to latch on to some of this. And you may find that, like some of the Fortune 500 companies before you, that you can save time and money and actually build a more competitive product with some of these features in your arsenal. So I'll talk about a couple more ways that you can improve performance. And then in order to show you how to use some of Caddy's features, I will kind of introduce you to how to configure Caddy so that you can know how to go in and make those changes. So the first performance tip I have for you is actually to consider embedding your site in the binary. So you can obviously run FrankenPHP and a PHP site by just having PHP files and your site in a folder somewhere, and that's fine. But that still is going to have some disk I/O, and you still have to upload the server and the files and everything separately. So if you embed your site into your server binary, now you have one upload and you just run it, and you can't break it. I mean, not by updating your system dependencies or anything. You can't break it. It's all self-contained. But I'm not going to go into detail about this because Boaz, sitting right there, has a great talk in a couple hours about this very thing. So I'll let him go into detail about it. Okay, clicker's working. So next, I would suggest that you look into using HTTP 103 early hints. So this is a status code that allows you to send headers before you send your content. What's special, I mean, that's how HTTP always works, but what's special is that you send these, you send this status in addition to headers later on. So what you do, the basic idea is very simple. You send a link header before you do something slow or expensive, and it tells the browser to load that resource while you're running your PHP script, like your database queries or your algorithms. And then when you're done, then you send the HTML page or the output, the API response. And so this can improve your load times quite significantly. Now, if you want to shave off a few more milliseconds, you might consider doing this in the web server directly. That way you don't have to invoke the PHP interpreter at all. This is an example of what that might look like in a Caddy config. This is a little bit of a Caddy file that for your heavy pages, as it were, you send a link header with the resources to load. You send that with a 103 status, and then you continue on to the PHP server. So this may be slightly faster even, or you may want to not worry about this in your PHP code. Maybe you just want your PHP to deal strictly with business logic, and you want your web server to be focused on the web stuff and the performance stuff, and that's what this is for. Now, of course, if you're going to do this, you need to know where to put this and where that belongs. So in the API platform repository, you just find your Caddy file, which is at this location, and you make the changes, and you save it, and that's it. FrankenPHP will see the changes and automatically reload. And all config changes in Caddy are graceful, they're lightweight, there's zero downtime, so don't worry about making changes and having to deal with losing connections or anything like that. If you are running in production with a Docker container, you might need to rebuild the container, but this is the basic idea. Now, I've talked a lot about the Caddy file as how you configure Caddy or FrankenPHP, and that's true, but I think you should know that Caddy's config language is actually JSON, and there's several reasons for this, but the idea is that you can actually convert many config formats into JSON to run, and that way we kind of put an end to the config format wars. You can just use whatever config format you like, and Caddy just runs JSON. So this is how you might run Caddy with a YAML config, if you like pain. Or this is how you can adapt it to JSON if you want to convert it to JSON and then work with it more. There's a lot of config adapters that are plugins. The Caddy file's built in, that just works. There's YAML, there's Q, you can even run it with Nginx config. So to visualize this, here's a 2-line Caddy file that's a perfectly valid production config that tells Caddy to serve your site over HTTPS with automatically managed certificates and to serve static files. And it converts into this JSON, which is much more verbose, but it's very powerful, very flexible, and it's easy to automate because it's JSON. So pretty much every programming language, every scripting environment can manipulate this. And you can do some really powerful things. So if you do want to use JSON with API platform, all you do is run caddy adapt on the Caddy file in the API platform repository, make it into a JSON file, and then you tell API platform's FrankenPHP instance to point to that config instead of the Caddy file. So you just change the Docker file there. And that's it. And then you can run JSON directly. Now, one of the reasons you might want to do that will become clear as I talk about some of these features here. The first thing that I think you'll really appreciate that Caddy can do, that maybe ironically you didn't know it could do as an API platform user, is it has a config API. So that means that you can make online zero downtime config changes to your web server, and this is really useful if your config is constantly changing. And now maybe you don't need to constantly change your config, and that's fine. But I think a lot of our users have found this to be beneficial because they might have, maybe they're selling to businesses or customers that are making setting changes, and when they make a change, they need to update the server in real time. And so we have a lot of users who are doing that. And this comes with API platform, so you already have this feature. To use this API, there's a post load endpoint, and this is how you give Caddy a new configuration. You can use any config format you want here. You can use JSON, of course, but you can also use the Caddy file or whatever config adapter you prefer to use. And this is a zero downtime, graceful reload. It's very easy. You can, of course, get the running config with a GET request, and this prints out the JSON that Caddy is running. You'll always get JSON, even if you give it a Caddy file, because Caddy runs JSON. But what's really useful about this, actually, is that you can drill down into the config. So if you want to get just this HTTP route right here, you can add to your path apps/http/servers/my-server/routes. When you do that, you get just that part of the config. So this is really useful if you want to make changes to or see just a particular part of your config without changing the whole thing or risk changing the whole thing. So as you might expect, a post will set the config in that place. If you want to update, for example, this just sets a listener address or adds a listener. This also works with put and patch and delete, just the way you might expect with a truly RESTful API that I'm sure you're familiar with. If you delete the config, it just unloads the running configuration and does nothing until you post a new config. Now, dealing with paths into the config can be a little tedious because they can get long, and if your config is changing, it can be a little annoying. And so we have these @id shortcuts that JSON LD has a similar concept, but you basically just give an object in your config a name, and then you can access it directly. And that's really useful. We also have thought of concurrency. So if you have multiple readers and writers that are messing with your config, you can make sure that that's safe to do with some HTTP headers. Every response is going to give you an E tag that if you put it on a request that you make later, that request will only succeed if the E tag still matches. If it's been changed in the meantime, then it will reject it and you just retry. So I hope you'll play with Caddy's config API. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of fun, and you just have to SSH into your local host in order to use it. But if you want to use it remotely, you can do that too. We just need to set up some security around it. And of course, this feature comes with the API platform. So to get remote access, all you do is tell Caddy the domain name that you're serving, and give it the listen address, the socket you want to open for your secure admin endpoint. Caddy will get a certificate for this domain name and keep it renewed so that you can always connect securely to it. Well then, we just need to authenticate the clients who are using the API. Here, you specify the public keys that you want to allow and which paths and methods within the config you want to give them permission to use. So maybe some users are read-only in some places and can post or delete in other areas. So that's up for you to decide. You do need to use the JSON config for this though. The Caddy file doesn't yet have a way to express this, but this is a very powerful and secure feature, I think. Now, I had mentioned that Caddy's flagship feature is to automate TLS certificates. And this is really useful if you have tens or hundreds of thousands of sites that you're serving. Now you might think, oh, come on, Matt, who has 100,000 sites to serve? Well, a lot of our users actually are selling services where their customers can bring their own domain name or multiple domain names. As kind of a premium feature, kind of a custom labeling service, if that makes sense. And so Caddy has a feature called on-demand TLS that makes this really easy. I'm actually curious though, there aren't like a ton of you here, but how many of you, is there anyone here who is using building a site or would like to offer a like a custom domain service or feature for their site? Got a handful. Okay, yeah, there's a handful of you. So this is how to do it, in my opinion. If you try and throw 100,000 domains at certbot and nginx, it will fall over, pretty much for sure. So this is a really simple Caddy config. Actually, you just enable on-demand TLS for unnamed sites, and you give Caddy an endpoint that it can ask for permission to make sure that it's authorized to get a certificate for that domain name. That is just an endpoint that you create that maybe does like a database lookup to see if you recognize the domain, to see if it's allowed. Otherwise, you're open to abuse, I suppose. You just want to make sure that only your customers, for example, can get domain names. But this works because, in theory, if domain name is pointed at your server, the moment someone tries to access it, Caddy will hold on to that TLS handshake while it gets a certificate, and then it will serve that certificate immediately to complete the handshake. And that can take a few seconds, but that first handshake is the only one that is slower, and then it's instant after that. And this scales really well because Caddy will keep the certificate renewed as long as it's being used, and it will discard it after it expires and is no longer being used. So this is something that I can show you, and so that's why I had you point a domain name at that IP address. Hopefully by now the record is propagated. So we're going to see if this works. I'm going to start the server, and then what you will do after I start it is you can visit the domain in your browser, on your phone, whatever client you prefer. Give it a few seconds. I haven't tried it with a group this large. I know there's some online watching as well. But after the first load, it should be instant if you refresh after that. And you can find that button in your browser or equivalent, whatever browser you're using, and verify that you have a valid certificate, which, if the page loads at all, it has a valid certificate. So let me keep breathing and do this. All right. Okay, so I have logs running here. And if you visit your domain, they will appear here, I should say. This might be public. If it works for you, I don't know, let me know. Do you want to clap? Do you want to yell? Do something? Yeah, this is cool. We got Caddy demo. Yeah, this is great. Okay, so you can see here that Caddy's getting certificates and serving them in real time. You should see this page, and it kind of explains what that feature is doing and how it's working. This is a $1 million feature for your product, by the way. This has only been possible in the last few years relative to the history of the web. So something else that Caddy can do really well is automate your TLS internally in your own infrastructure. So this is probably more useful if you have microservices, which I don't know if that's probably very common with API platform, but if you're ever working on systems that have a lot of internal nodes that need to communicate with each other, then this can be useful. And this is traditionally difficult because you can't get a publicly trusted certificate for private host names. Makes sense. Public certificate authorities cannot verify the identities of private identifiers. But the good news is that Caddy comes with built-in features for this, and you don't have to do anything special to get this because it comes with API platform. So the way this works is you'll set up a server a Caddy instance or FrankenPHP, but all you need really is Caddy for this, is this top server here is a root certificate authority that you set up to sign certificates for all of your machines. And then you install that root certificate on those machines, and then you can connect between those machines just fine, just as if it was a publicly trusted certificate. So there's the two sides. I'll show you both in terms of Caddy config. So one is you'll run Caddy as a root certificate authority. And this is as simple as using the Acme server directive. This is an HTTP handler. Acme is the protocol that automates certificate management. And it's the same thing Let's Encrypt uses, although we use a more of a, well, not globally scalable to 500 million certificates kind of architecture. But and then up here, you just give the certificate authority an ID and a name, like a visible human-friendly name. And that's it. And you can choose whether this server is publicly accessible or not. It doesn't have to be, can be. No one's going to trust the certificates it signs anyway, except for you. So then all your other instances, this is assuming they are Caddy instances, but you just have them point to that root certificate authority. So the Acme server, this would be the Caddy instance you just set up. And each Caddy instance would have your internal host name. And I mean, this is just a hello world example, but you would probably have a PHP server or something. And this will get a valid trusted certificate from your own internal certificate authority, which is very useful. And so then you can have valid, trusted TLS within your infrastructure. And again, on this end, you don't have to use Caddy. This could be any HTTP or TLS client, as long as that root certificate is trusted, and as long as you're using that Acme server to get certificates from your root CA. Cool. And then kind of the last thing that I wanted to talk about is Caddy's extensibility. This is kind of also a flagship feature from the very beginning back in 2015. I actually realized yesterday that Caddy and API platform have very similar birthdays, I think within a few weeks, first commits. But anyways, so plugins are useful if you want Caddy to do something out of the box that it doesn't do out of the box. And the reason is that Caddy plugins, they're a little different than you might be used to in that you compile them in statically into the binary. And this is compatible with API Platform, which itself uses Caddy plugins. You can either use our building tool, xCaddy, to extend Caddy with whatever plugins you want. For example, Cache Handler, which is actually being maintained by Sylvan. Sylvan, is that right? Yeah, so he's speaking later today. And then you can also, if you have a running Caddy build, you can also just run this command to add an existing package. So we try and make it easy. And there's a ton of plugins. So API Platform itself comes with several, Mercure, Vulkan, FrankenPHP that power your API Platform sites. But you can also add others. If you want server-side caching, if you want, the DNS providers are useful if you're interacting with your DNS records at all. You can replace content in responses. I'm not going to go through all these, but rate limiter, TCP proxy, if you need that for things other than HTTP. We even have an SSH server or event handlers if you need to execute commands when Caddy does something. There's all sorts of things. There's a security plugin. And honestly, you could write your own. They're just little Go programs. You just compile them into Caddy like I showed you. Although I got to thinking about it, y'all aren't Go programmers. So that might be annoying to have to learn Go and make your web server to extend your web server. But I was realizing that, Caddy plugins, they're statically compiled in. Sure, they implement custom functionality, and they're enabled. You turn them on in your server config, but that's kind of what you do with your API platform sites, your PHP sites with FrankenPHP, right? I mean, you can statically compile them in. And so I realized that all your PHP sites are kind of extensions to your web server with this architecture. Well, that blew my mind. So I guess you don't even have to learn Go to extend your web server. You can just write a PHP script and compile it in with FrankenPHP, and I don't know, tomatoes, right? So anyway, that's kind of just a sample of a lot of Caddy's features that I hope that this has been helpful for you. The whole reason that I wanted to talk about this is because I think that giving you this kind of information can help you have an advantage over your competitors. And wow, that is a way brighter green than on my computer screen. Sorry. But it must be a different color space. I don't know. But anyway, I think that there are things you can do, interesting things you can do for your products that you couldn't do otherwise, or at least not easily. And so maybe this has given you some inspiration. It turns out that most people will use the products of companies that sponsor or support open source software, like API Platform or the Caddy web server. And so I want to encourage you to talk to your company about supporting and sponsoring open source projects like this, which make it possible for example, me to continue working on it full time. And we have a team of great maintainers. You probably met Francis a couple years ago when he spoke about Caddy at this very conference. I would love to pay. We have Mohammed. We've got contributors from China and all over the world, and I would love to also be able to offer them opportunities to get paid to work on this. And so we just need more sponsors to grow the project. We're very grateful to have sponsors like ZeroSSL and Stripe, the payments company, and of course our very own Les-Tilleuls. How'd I do, Kevin? Not bad. Okay, you're very nice. But I would recommend that looking into this, because this is a very real way to make sure that your software stack stays maintained. And we'd love to put your logo on our website. You can see, the beautiful Les-Tilleuls logo there. But anyway, I hope that this has been interesting and helpful, and I just want to thank you for letting me come to speak. So thank you very much.